The 360 on Energy and Carbon podcast, hosted by 360 Energy. Bob Willard left an award-winning career as a senior management leader at IBM to pursue sustainability strategies for businesses. Bob is a sustainability expert, giving keynote presentations to corporate, government, university, and NGO audiences around the world. This episode is filled with industry knowledge and key points to get your organization on the right sustainability track.
Well, welcome back, John.
It's good to be back, but it does feel like, we're missing something without having Lysandra with us.
And we're going to see how this rolls out. We are very fortunate to have Bob Willard. Bob is actually, we were discussing prior, he was actually one of our first podcast guests. We've now been running this podcast for 4 years, and Bob is a Canadian who's a sustainability champion and talks around the world about how companies can profit by pursuing sustainability. And so I'm so glad and pleased, Bob, for you to be here. Thank you so much for coming today.
Thank you. And it's always fun to have a conversation with you guys. So I'm looking forward to this.
Good. We are too.
So Bob, I'll kick this off. You have been doing this work, and I've known you since 2011, but you've been doing sustainability work like for a long time.
Quite a while.
A real champion and really valuable to not only people like ours, but to big major corporations. And a lot of things you do and the resources you make available, you make them free, which is really helpful for people that are interested. So I'm gonna go down this route because I know you've done a lot of work in advancing procurement and getting to the net zero procurement, which we know is really critical. I'll start this off. So, the traditional procurement practices focus on getting the best price, but net zero goals are driving a shift towards best value, which includes sustainability matrix. You've developed a comprehensive toolkit to make transition seamless. Can you explain how this fundamental shift in procurement thinking creates a competitive advantage for businesses while simultaneously driving supply chain decarbonization?
Yeah, sure. So first of all, let's just position procurement in the range of options that are available to companies to try to address issues that they care about. It's becoming increasingly evident to organizations that they are mutually accountable for what's happening in their supply chains. So if their suppliers are using inappropriate labor practices, that's not good. If they are polluting with their operation, that's not good. And it used to be that companies could kind of blow that off and say, it's not our problem. That's our suppliers. We don't have any control over our suppliers. But they're not getting away with that anymore. They're now being held mutually accountable, not only for the impact of their own operation on people and planet, but also the impacts of their suppliers on people and planet. So when we talk about sustainable procurement, we're talking about the people who are purchasing goods and services on behalf of their organization, not only looking at the attributes of the goods and services, which of course are really important, but also the attributes of the companies that are producing them. So the supplier's impact as well as the product attributes are now both important. So I'm on the board of an organization called the Sustainable Purchasing Leadership Council, SPLC, in the US, and they help organizations self-assess where they are on sustainable procurement, the extent to which they've embedded that approach into their procurement practices. For some of them, they're starting off not looking at all of the impacts, but starting off looking at carbon, the carbon that's coming from the operations of their suppliers. Why are they looking at that? Because when organizations are reporting on their carbon footprint, of course they report on the carbon that's being emitted from their burning of fuels, fossil fuels, for their own operations in various ways, as well as the emissions that are coming from whatever source they're using for their power, their energy. And now they're also responsible for emissions that are being triggered in the rest of their value chain by their suppliers and even by their customers when they use the products that the company is producing. So that gets into net zero, focusing on carbon and circularity to try to reduce the amount of carbon that's being used, as we produce new products rather than reusing products and so on. So when we talk about net zero procurement, what we're acknowledging is that if a company is buying a product, a good or service, they are now accountable for the carbon footprint of that product in the year in which they purchase it. So if they buy a computer or a car or a stapler, they are accountable for figuring out how much carbon is embodied in that product, which is a tricky kind of thing. I mean, how the heck do you figure that out? Because what we're talking about is how much carbon was emitted, how much greenhouse gases were emitted when the product was shipped to the organization, to the customer, packaged, put together, all of the parts and so on, and even back to the extraction of the metal that's in the product and the plastic that's in the product as well, trying to make sure that the plastic is accounted for because that's a petroleum product. So you go right back to the source of those things. And as all of the various components of this were produced and packaged and so on, it took energy to do that. And much of that energy is coming from fossil fuels. And therefore, the embodied carbon in a product like this is something which companies are now responsible for. You wouldn't think that would be very much. It turns out that it's by far the biggest contributor to the carbon footprint of a company is the carbon associated with the products that they're purchasing. There have been some studies done by CDP, it used to be called the Carbon Disclosure Project, now it's just called CDP, that have tried to figure out, compared to Scope 1, the operational emissions, and Scope 2, the emissions coming from wherever you're getting your energy, how much is coming from the rest of your value chain? One study they did a few years ago said it's 11 times greater than your Scope 1 and 2 combined. And then they thought, geez, that's kind of high. We should redo that calculation. Turns out they were wrong. It's 26 times. 26 times. So it's a lot. And the federal government of Canada, for example, if you take a look at their carbon footprint, the 76% of their carbon footprint is associated with the goods and services that they purchase every year. So it's a significant thing. And they're now accountable for that. So obviously, they would like their suppliers to reduce the carbon footprint that's associated with whatever they're buying. So they need them to not only pay attention to that, but also reduce their Scope 1 and 2 emissions, the supplier Scope 1 and 2 emissions that are contributing to that embedded carbon. So that's what net zero procurement is all about. It's saying to the supplier, by the way, how's it going on reducing your Scope 1 and 2 emissions? Because we know those are contributing to the carbon that's embodied in the products that we're getting from you. And most suppliers, for whatever reason, haven't been paying much attention to that. It would be good if they did, but they haven't. The majority of companies on the planet haven't been doing a very good job of at least keeping track of how their greenhouse gas emissions are going, let alone reducing them.
Fair enough.
Well, why is that? Because regulators have been very hesitant to require them to do that in all jurisdictions because it's almost political suicide to start forcing companies to reduce the greenhouse gases. The voice of the customer, on the other hand, is not a regulation, it's a customer. So if the customer says, how's it going? I'd kind of like you to reduce your greenhouse gases, and they assign points to the score on how well you're doing on all of that, and they make those points matter in the bid appraisal, then magic happens. If it's important to the customer and they're making it count, all of a sudden you clean up your act. So that's the dynamic that we're looking for with net zero procurement. I'm less interested in the procurement part of net zero procurement than I am in the net zero part of net zero procurement.
Got it.
This is a way to get companies to want to reduce their greenhouse gases because they're going to win more bids, because they're going to score better with their customers who are buying their products.
So just a quick follow-up. So I think John and I have talked about this before. If every company did Scope 1 and 2, every company, from mining, extraction to parts to what, like right through the supply chain, effectively that information would be readily available for Scope 3 for a customer, right? That's the issue, is everyone has to do Scope 1 and 2 to enable this in the whole chain. to enable this information to flow, right?
Beautifully said. Yes, absolutely.
And I certainly, John, I know you're going to ask the next question, but I'm kind of curious because Bob, we're obviously exposed, you and I, to North America. Now we're doing some work in Europe. John's in Europe. John, I'm kind of curious. I get the impression Europeans are much further ahead on this scope 1 and 2 reporting, and so. And they, by the way, they've stayed the course. Like us North Americans, Bob, as you know, we waver depending on the political flavor that's happened. Not only in talking with John, but in my exposure with in Europe in the last 6 months, they have stayed the course. So, John, I'm interested in your take on how do you make that stickiness happen? Is it just a political will, or?
I think it's interesting what you're touching on there. I think one, we have, and I'm going to talk about the EU in particular, even though the UK is not part of it. The EU has been very good at putting in place standards, regulations that are carbon focused. And I think that helps. Where we've got a problem, I mean, our government has been committed to having carbon budgets and everything else. But where we are having a problem is the term net zero, certainly in the UK and in some other jurisdictions, has now become a political football or even a political landmine. And we have, I'm going to be blunt here, we have certain right-wing politicians who think that net zero is nonsense. I mean, we've just had a situation here where our county council has had a bit of a shift in its members, and the head of environment is not 100% sure about climate change. So it does get a bit tricky there. But I think what we have done well in Europe up to now is putting things into legislation as well as other things. But I think we have to go back to Bob's original point. Customer pressure is even more powerful.
Yes, and it avoids all of those political games and the ebb and flow of commitment to doing something about these things and the enactment of regulations and then withdrawal of the regulations and so on. And this yo-yo effect of attention, no attention, no attention to all of this, it looks like it's going to continue for a while, especially with what's happening in the United States. So yeah. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of time to wait for this.
The clock is ticking. And the other thing I want to come back on this, whilst I was sort of saying the positive about we have regulation, this is personal view, but I have real concern, certainly in the UK, about the quality of draftsmanship of both legislation and regulation relating to climate issues. And if we're not careful, regulations put in that aren't thought out properly can actually steer things in the wrong direction. You know, it's the law of unintended consequences in some ways.
And companies are really good at gaming the system as well. Once they understand what the regulation is, it's amazing how creative they can be on making it look like they're paying attention to it when they're not really. So, or delaying and all of those other games. So the voice of the customer, I think, is going to be increasingly important to blow away all of those other discussions. And if your customer think this is important and they're giving you a score on how you're doing on this, and that score matters when they're assessing how you compare to other suppliers, then I think we've got a market force here that's going to help us go in the right direction. So that's really the grand plan, which is to use procurement as a market force, not a regulation, a market force. And it's actually a voluntary market force to get the attention of businesses that otherwise would not be looking at reducing their greenhouse gases. And why would that be? Because it incents them to want to do that because they're going to get more points than their competitors.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? We talk about procurement, but if we go personal and we talk about shopping and we make decisions, and I mean, I know certainly a lot of younger people who are questioning sustainability and questioning the ethics and whatever of the organisations that they're buying their household and day-to-day goods and services from. And that does actually reflect up. I mean, it's something we certainly done as a household. When you're in this business, you've got to try and do what you can. So, we have sort of almost a rolling program of looking at the things we regularly buy and saying, have we reduced the environmental impact? What becomes interesting with it, though, is if you can have a really super sustainable product and it's twice the price of the non-sustainable product, or there's a sustainable alternative that's not as good as the non-sustainable one. And these are challenges that you have to deal with. But there's no reason at all why companies can't be doing the same thing when they're doing their procurement.
Good point. Absolutely. Absolutely. And if you take a look at the biggest customers in most countries, the biggest customer in Canada, anyway, is the federal government.
Yes.
They buy more goods and services than any other entity in Canada, company or other government. Some of the provinces have very large annual spend as well. And municipalities, when you add them in collectively, that's a huge spend. But when you're looking for leverage, when you're looking for scale on this, if we can get the biggest customer in Canada to start asking their suppliers, all their suppliers, not just the big guys, all the suppliers, the small and medium-sized enterprises as well, how is it going on reducing your greenhouse gases, and give them a score on how it's going and make that score matter, then we're going to get the attention of the majority of businesses. And why would we care about that as a country or as people that are trying to do something on climate change? 80% of the emissions in Canada are coming from businesses. All businesses are suppliers. All businesses have customers. By definition, they're all suppliers. So if we can start to leverage procurement as a way to engage suppliers, businesses in this, that's a good thing. And if you're wondering why we want to go after small and medium-sized businesses as well, SMEs, they don't individually emit all that much, but there are a heck of a lot of them.
In Canada, 93% of businesses are SMEs, right?
Actually, it's 99.7.
Is it?
99.7% of the companies in Canada are SMEs by the definition used by Stats Canada, which is 500 employees or less. If you drop it down to 100 employees or less, it's 98.1. So we've got 1.1 million companies in Canada. The majority of them are SMEs. And if you take a look at their collective greenhouse gas emissions, it's 42% of the emissions in Canada. So what we need to do is engage them. Most of them are in a supply chain, either of a public sector organization or of a private sector organization. So if we can start to get the large buyers to use net zero procurement, which is not only looking at the attributes of the product, but also of the company that made the product, and how committed they are to science-based targets relative to their 2030 and 2050 targets on reducing greenhouse gases, then I think we've got a little traction on being able to do something that's going to matter. So that's my ploy. I'm trying to get the federal government of Canada to do that. Up until recently, I've been focusing on the procurement people, understandably, because it's procurement at the federal level. And although they agree that this would be a good thing, they're kind of preoccupied with other stuff right now. So the sense of urgency is a little less than theirs, is a little less than mine. But on the other hand, if I look at the net zero part, the ministry that's responsible for reducing Canada's greenhouse gases is Environment and Climate Change Canada. Great name for the organization. Environment and Climate Change Canada. So they are responsible for figuring out how the heck they're going to get Canada's greenhouse gas emissions down to net zero by 2050.
So, Bob, I need to share with you. So I was in Luxembourg. I was asked to speak to NATO. And NATO has a need and a want to create deployable energy infrastructure because of climate change and bad actors taking advantage of countries. Why I'm bringing this up to you is their focus is to use renewable energy as primarily as much as they can. And in the meeting, it was a day-long meeting, they purchased $7.4 billion worth of product and are now are used as clearinghouses for countries. So maybe Canada might be doing it, but it looks like NATO, which is the procurement group we were working with, they're looking at doing this stuff, Bob. And they actually understand the need and requirement to do so just for energy security reasons, let alone because of climate change. So it looks like there's people looking at this. And again, they're primarily European, even though Canada and United States is in NATO. But it looks like there's some traction, just to give you some hope here for sure.
Yeah, and that's really encouraging. And they've been looking at that for a while, not only for climate change reasons, but also heat-seeking missiles can find a diesel generator a lot faster than it can find a solar panel. So you kind of see why they'd rather have something other than what they've been using up until now as their source of power when they're wandering around.
That makes it personal, doesn't it?
That's actually, Bob, you're probably spot on that one, by the way. They didn't say that, but I think you may have noted that. That's good.
Right.
Okay, second question. In a blog, you explained how deploying net zero procurement with speed and scale will win the GHG reduction trifecta, which is reducing product carbon footprints to net zero, reducing business GHG emissions to net zero, and mitigating the global climate crisis at the same time. And this sounds almost too good to be true. So could you walk us through a real-world example of how a company's procurement decisions can create this triple impact and what makes procurement such a powerful lever for system-wide change?
Yeah, actually, the question that you asked almost has the answer. What we're trying to do is use procurement to encourage suppliers to reduce the carbon footprint of their products. They can't do that unless they reduce their scope 1 and 2 emissions that are contributing to that carbon footprint. So basically what we're asking them to do is to get their scope 1 and 2 emissions down to zero. And if they're down to zero, then there's no contribution to this. Not only the supplier that is the one that you're buying it from, but all of the other suppliers that created the parts and mined the minerals and got the oil and gas, fossil fuels for the plastic and so on. So it's way into the supply chain. And in fact, let me just address that for a second. Net zero procurement goes after the contribution to the carbon footprint that the supplier that you're purchasing this from is contributing. But what about the rest of the supply chain, the tier 2, tier 3, tier 4 suppliers? How do we get to them? Part of the approach that I'm suggesting be used by the government is that they not only score the suppliers on how well they're doing on reducing their greenhouse gases, but they also give them bonus points if they use net zero procurement with their suppliers and so on. So you get a ripple effect through the supply chain of everyone being encouraged by their customers to reduce their greenhouse gases, being scored by those things, and so on. And that's how you get into the private sector. My suggestion is that the public sector, governments, ask their suppliers, but very often the suppliers of those suppliers are private sector organizations. So that's how you get into the corporate world as well as the government world on all of this. So that ripple effect is really an important part. And the bonus points are enough to get their attention and make them want to at least explore that as something which they can do. And if we give them tools that help them do that, if we give them a questionnaire, say, just ask your supplier to fill out this questionnaire. You don't even have to answer it because it's self-scoring. You don't have to know all of this yourselves. It's self-scoring. All you do is you take the score, plug it into the bid appraisal, and use that to determine how many of the points associated with that in the bid appraisal have been earned by the supplier. It's packaged in a way that is intended to make it really easy to implement. There are some questionnaires out there that already do this. I've created another one, which I think is more appropriate for our small and medium-sized enterprises. It's free. All we have to do is get a platform to put it on, and there are multiple candidates out there for that as well. And if we get the government of Canada to help municipalities and provinces and themselves to do that, I think we'll be home free. So I really think that the part of the federal government that is the focal point for all of this is the part that is responsible for reducing the carbon associated with the operation of businesses in Canada. So the 2030 Emissions Reduction Plan, that's the name of it. So the government of Canada has something called the 2030 Emissions Reduction Plan. So what they want to do is by 2030, reduce the carbon emissions, the greenhouse gas emissions of Canada by 40 to 45% lower than they were in 2005. That's the objective by 2030. They have 117 actions associated with that plan. It has $9.1 billion worth of funding. And an audit that was done of how it's going a couple of years ago by the Auditor General of Canada showed that they're nowhere close to being where they should be by now. It's not working. So I have a great idea, an 18th action that they could do, which is net zero procurement. Implement that at the federal level and then ripple it through the rest of the levels of government in Canada. And I think we'll have a fighting chance of being able to meet their objectives. The problem that they're having with all of the actions that they've got right now is that businesses are not taking advantage of all the different ways the government is trying to help them make this transition away from fossil fuels to renewable energy. And they're not taking advantage because they're not motivated. They don't give a hoot. So we want the government as a customer to say, we give a hoot. We want to deal with companies that share that concern. So how's it going? Give them a score. So the voice of the customer, as you probably know, in a previous life, I worked for a company called IBM Canada. Much of that experience was in marketing. In marketing, you respond to requests for proposals, RFPs. So I was a supplier, and our customers were the customers. So some of the customers were huge companies, and some of them were governments. So for a while, I was stationed in Edmonton, and I was selling to the Alberta government. The Alberta government was my customer, and we would get RFPs from them and requests for proposals from them, and associated with the various specifications for the computer systems and other things, there were a number of points associated with all of those things. We knew which ones were worth the most points. Those are the ones we paid most attention to. So it was a very clear arrangement that the things that were important to our customer were obviously important to us. So there was one time when we got an RFP from the government of Alberta, and they asked us all about the attributes of the computer system that they thought they needed. And then they asked about us as a company, the parts availability and the resources that we were going to use to support the operation and all that good stuff. And then there was this question. It was worth 13 points, so it got our attention. It was a lot of points. And it was, to what extent does your company contribute to the economy of Alberta? I thought, what the heck? They're buying a computer system. Like what's that got to do with a computer system? But they asked the question, and they gave it a lot of points. So by definition, that was important to our customer. I never thought about that. But all of a sudden, I could see that it was in my self-interest to think about that a little bit. So I put together the IBM in Alberta story. And it turned out, man, we were making a huge contribution directly and indirectly to the economy of Alberta, but I never really added it up before. My point is, I wouldn't have bothered doing that unless the customer asked me and had a lot of points associated with the answer. This was not a, by the way, just curious. This was an important thing to answer well. And fortunately, we were way ahead of whatever our competitors could say they were doing to contribute to the economy of Alberta. So we won that bid. Actually, we won most of the bids. And it was because they asked things that were important to them. And if they were important to them, they were important to us. And we wanted to make damn sure we were giving better answers than our competitors did. And that's the dynamic that we need to tap into to be able to motivate, incent businesses to reduce their greenhouse gases, regulate them into reducing their greenhouse gases, incent them. Capitalism can work in our favor for once on all of this stuff.
I I'm in total agreement, and I'm going to go completely off script because of the amount of time we are currently at. But Bob, what you're saying makes complete sense. It makes complete sense, right? So here's a question. It makes complete sense. This is what the government has to do. You've got to actually have a plan. By the way, it's not a get rich plan for Bob Willard. It's a plan that the government can execute, right? That they can execute.
Absolutely.
Why isn't the government doing it?
I don't know. I ask myself that just about every day. It is so glaringly obvious that it's not hard. It's really easy to do. I've got a toolkit that makes it really easy to do. I've figured out all of the things we need in order to make it work. I've put together a briefing note that explains all of this and so on. Initially, I was trying to lowball how much was going to be required in terms of money to do this. And I started to realize, actually, maybe that's the wrong strategy. Maybe I need to make it look a little more expensive. So I took a look at the 117 actions that are in the emissions reduction plan, and I wanted to find out how much budget was associated with the key ones. So they have a list of the key actions, and the amount of money associated with them was somewhere between $25 million and 2.1 billion for an individual action. One of the 107. I thought, okay, so it needs to be somewhere in that range. So I put together a briefing note that says it's going to cost between 30 and 50 million dollars. Then I went to my MP, who is a parliamentary secretary to the Minister of Finance, and I said, "Is this a lot of money? Like, is this a big deal?" He said, "Actually, it's a rounding error. I mean, it's not a lot of money. But if we had that amount of money, we could put together the questionnaire and a way of deploying it and keeping track of it and scoring it and giving advice back to them using AI and so on what they might do to improve. We could set up a support center to help SMEs figure all of this stuff out. We could ripple it through the provinces and the territories and the municipalities. We could really get traction on this, and we could do it really fast. So that's my plan. And if we did it at the federal level, there's $37 billion a year that they spend. So that's a lot of market force. If we ripple it out to the provinces and territories, that adds more to it. So it's up to $200 billion a year. And if we perfect this in Canada, we can roll it out into other jurisdictions. So the next COP that comes up, the one coming up in November, or maybe the one after that, we can go to that COP and say, oh, by the way, we're a proving ground for this. And as you know, we can really clean up our act as a country, which is fantastic. But Canada's emissions are only 1.4% of the world's emissions. So we need to engage the rest of the world. There are 195 countries that are at COP. So what we need to do is go to them and make our system available to them so we can engage them. That would unleash $9 trillion worth of market force around the world. And I think we'll have a fighting chance of being able to get to where we need to get to on reducing our greenhouse gases in time. So otherwise, frankly, and I've been thinking about this for a long time, I can't think of any other way we're going to do what needs to be done on reducing greenhouse gases than unleashing net zero procurement.
Okay, so again, completely understand and support because we know the work John and I do. Managing energy is a no-brainer, but truthfully, most corporations don't do it.
Yeah.
Right? Just like you're saying, this is a no-brainer to reduce emissions and clean up our act. But now, so and what happens with us is they think, oh, it's way too expensive or we don't have the time. I've heard these excuses for 29 years, by the way. It's the same excuses.
Yeah, and we're just trying to survive the tariff wars
Right,
and so on.
Yeah, it just keeps changing. I'm going to ask you a question because for our listeners, we're based here in Canada. John's in the UK, but we have an abundance of energy. Clean energy, but we also have fossil fuels. Is it possible there's powers to be that believe the work that is being proposed would somehow negate tax revenue that the federal government would get because it would reduce the fossil fuels being used? And would that have, is there any inkling that possibly is that an ulterior thought process of why we shouldn't do it.
I'd be surprised, actually, if that were the case, because what you're suggesting is that the amount of tax that we collect from the oil and gas sector is going to be high enough that if they lost that, they wouldn't have an opportunity to make it from other sources.
That's right. And I don't have the facts, Bob. I'm just kind of wondering, because it seems like a no-brainer, right? What you're saying.
Yeah, but if the oil and gas sector weren't there anymore, all of the perverse subsidies that we're giving to them wouldn't be necessary any longer.
Right.
So at least we'd save that. And that would more than offset, I think, whatever taxes. And by the way, we're getting less and less tax. And those companies are not Canadian companies. They're American companies. They're American companies that we are subsidizing to rip this stuff out of the ground and make it available around the world. And the Pathways Alliance has been making noises about, which is the consortium of oil and gas companies in the tar sands, have been making noises that they really do care about climate change, and they're going to solve all of this by using carbon capture and storage. Fortunately, the Competition Bureau has passed an anti-greenwashing legislation, which caused them to kind of back off from a lot of those claims. In fact, they took down their website after that legislation got passed because it was all, frankly, lies. And also, even if there were zero emissions coming from the tar sands for the operation of that, 80% of the emissions associated with oil and gas are when we burn it as a fuel, not when we extract it and refine it, when we burn it. So, from a global perspective, if their carbon footprint was zero, we still have a huge problem from the use of what it was that they produced with zero carbon footprint.
John, I know we've thrown out the script.
Yeah, I'm with you on this. I think let's not bother about the rest of it.
No.
I want to explore something where Bob was saying about it looked too cheap and trying to put a 30 to 50 million price on it. One of the things that I've come across, and I wonder if this is the case, there are an awful lot of people who are involved in the area we're talking about, who are, shall we say, so focused on technology to solve the problem rather than behavioural change and other things. And I think as well, sometimes people, because, if you're just looking at a company level trying to implement behaviour change, it's a challenge because you can't bolt it in, switch it on, and it works. And I wonder whether there is an element of, if you like, the lack of uptake by government or whatever, because it isn't one of those things that ticks the technological boxes.
Well, it can, though. I mean, God, when you think about the transition from fossil fuels to renewable energies, there's a lot of technology involved in that transition. Also, the use of AI as an aid to what we do and how we do it is also very, very possible. So, for example, if you wanted to not only score the suppliers on each of their questionnaires on how they're doing on reducing their greenhouse gases and their plans to do more, after you get the results of the questionnaire, you can use AI to give them a recommended next 2 or 3 things that they might want to focus on to be able to go further than they already are. And those tools already exist. So I think there are ways we can use technology, both digitalization of the questionnaire and AI advice and guidance on what to do next and so on, as well as some of the more hardcore technology associated with renewable energy. We can figure all this stuff out. It's not a question of this being hard. It's a question of the will to do it.
Yes. And Bob, I thought about this again. So this whole transition, the electrification, which is really what is required. I think there's another possible bottleneck is the current energy ecosystem that we know of, the government, the agencies, the regulators, the transmission, the distribution. The summary is they aren't moving quick enough to the speed of which customers need to act or want to act, by the way. Right. And I'm wondering, again, we need to be very mindful. I'm wondering if somehow that's resonating or it's understood. Now, again, there's always a way to fix this if you have a will to do it. Like, I'm a firm believer in that. But if you have this excuse, oh, we can't do it, or I'm told it's going to take years, then that slows down people. And we hear it all the time. Like, oh no, we can't do it. We don't have. No, you can do it. And it makes complete economic sense. But they hear all these different opinions that stalls people, right? For sure.
Yeah, once you decide that you're going to do it, it's amazing what you can do quickly. So if you take the tariff wars, for example, that are going on, it's amazing that billions of dollars that are being thrown at that in different ways because it's urgent.
Yes.
It's urgent that we fix this. And when you add that level of urgency to these other things like climate change, it's amazing what you can do once you decide to do it. And you can do it in a way that not only redirects some funds in a better way, but also creates a stronger economy. So if you take a look at the priorities that the federal government of Canada has right now, for example, a mandate letter that outlined the 7 priorities, the words strong economy just ripple through all of that, cost of living, all of those things. And what we need to do is to be able to show how what we're recommending is going to contribute to those.
Absolutely.
So I've taken the mandate letter of the federal government in one column, and another column I've shown how net zero procurement as part of the emissions reduction plan contributes to all of those priorities. And I think connecting those dots, talking the language of the people that we're trying to engage in this, and acknowledging their priorities and show how what we're suggesting is going to contribute to their priorities is really, really, really critical. I think we need to get better at that, of connecting the dots between what we're suggesting they do and what they want to do in the first place. And there's more and more evidence, by the way, that what got the current Liberal government in Canada into power, which was the trust that we had in their ability to deal with the tariff wars with Trump and company, that is becoming less and less important to people now. And cost of living, and even climate change, because of the fires and the smoke and stuff that we've had in Canada this summer, is becoming more top of mind. So this is going to help them stay focused on the priorities of Canadians and prove that they are not only able to deal with tariffs, but other issues that are important to us as well. So I think we just have to be better at selling and making sure that we're talking to the right people. So I'm working my way through the government maze to try to find out who's responsible for the emissions reduction plan and get to the minister through my MP on all of this and give her the briefing note and work it through. So it's coming, but God, it's slow.
It is slow.
Too slow, isn't it, really? As you were saying, that I think that is the problem. You know, we've got a clock ticking away. And I was just thinking as you were talking that I'm currently reading a book on economics, and it sort of really comes down to the fact that economic models don't really matter. It's what the political will is and what the politicians want to do. But then we hear the politicians are saying, this is risky, we don't want to do it. But we know the majority of people are concerned about climate change, and we've got this sort of circular reference like on Excel that's not working out properly. And I think that, combined with slow speed, worries me, because I think as well with some of the people who are net zero deniers, I'm not going to say climate change deniers, they're sort of saying we don't need to do anything about that, and they're not even thinking about adaptation to climate change, which is another element that we do have to think about, because if we are going slowly, we are going to see more and more physical impacts of climate change, which means we're going to have to do things to alleviate those. Looking at the health risks of super high temperatures and so on, all of this is going to have an economic effect. And it makes you can understand Bob's frustration. None of us are young, are we, on this call?
Yeah, we are, John.
Yeah,
We're very
we're
young
in mind.
in our heads.
It's all relative.
I can remember a long time back in this topic, sort of somebody saying, oh, I'm totally averse to nuclear power. And I sort of said, well, if you don't want nuclear power, we've got to clean up what energy we've got because we want to stop emitting carbon. And, well, no, maybe something else will happen. And we've just got this deferral. And I think it's when we had COVID, it was easy to mobilise money, governments and everything because there was
good point.
As the Americans would refer to it, a clear and present danger. And that allowed things to be done. I think what people are missing, I think we've got beyond the argument about is climate change real? It is real. And the chances are we're causing it. and it's an existential threat. But because it's a bit in the future and big sums of money are being hung on it, we've got ourselves into this loop of looking as if we're doing something, but our wheels are spinning. We're not getting traction.
But it's not in the future.
It's now.
No.
It's right now. It's right now. The difficulty is it's the boiled frog syndrome, that it's gradual. It's gradual. Every year it gets a little worse. And more days when we're in a heat dome. It's just a gradual kind of thing. Unfortunately, human beings don't deal well with gradual kinds of things. They like something right in their face and they can do something
about it. Crisis.
It's hard. And I just want to also come back to something that you mentioned earlier about what we call this. I'm calling it net zero procurement. That may be a ill-advised term in some circles. I'm thinking maybe we should call it impact procurement. You know how impact investing is done by investors who not only want a good return on their money, they also want to make a difference through organizations in which they invest their money. So impact investing is a way of doing something that you already are doing well, but also getting other value from it, which is making a difference. Impact procurement is like that as well. What I'm suggesting is that we not only get good products, goods and services, we don't want to ignore that. We also want a good price for them, but we also want to get good value because we want other things to happen as a result of that procurement. That adds the value. So when I talk about making sure we get best value as opposed to necessarily the best price for something, what we're doing is we're accomplishing multiple objectives with the procurement. Not only getting what we need in a quality product, but we're also addressing other issues using that as a market force. That's the value that we're getting from it. So we're accomplishing multiple objectives with the same action. And that to me is really what we need to be better at.
Bob, we could talk, I know, for hours on this subject. And it's so great to have you back on. And anything that this podcast can do to help you support to get the messaging out on this, please let us know. I'm going to close this off and ask you, what is the biggest takeaway for our listeners based on what you conveyed today that they should take from this podcast?
I think we have to be smarter at connecting the dots between what we think is a good thing to do and what other people think are better things to do, and help them see that what we're suggesting using their language is going to be helpful to their objectives. That's the first thing. The second thing is that I think we need to look for opportunities either in companies that we work in or in municipalities, cities, towns, and so on that we work in. I'm in Whitby, Ontario. I'm on the Sustainability Advisory Committee for Whitby. I'm using that as a platform to talk to the procurement people and the sustainability people in Whitby and encouraging them to use net zero procurement. So using that as a proving ground for this, working at a local level as well. As citizens, it's amazing how we can influence what's happening in the towns and cities that we live in. So look for those opportunities as well. And the third thing is, don't be afraid of appealing to people's concern about their family's future. I mean, this is an existential issue in more ways than one. And I think one of the advantages of companies paying attention to this is that they energize their employees when their employees see that the company is paying attention to issues that they are also concerned about as well. So one of the advantages of a company or an organization encouraging their suppliers to reduce their greenhouse gases is that they find that their employees are going to be more engaged because they see their company trying to make a difference. And that's a dynamic that I don't think we understand as well as we should, but it sure as heck works. And I think that that's one of the co-benefits of using net zero procurement or procurement as a lever on other sustainability issues as well. Employee engagement, employee productivity as a result of it. Plus, making more money. You're going to win more bids.
Thank you, Bob. John,
okay.
How about yourself?
Well, there's so much you could pick on, but I think the bit I'm going to pick on is I sometimes think some sustainability experts live in a bubble and not in the broader world. And I think if you're a sustainability expert, you need to understand the positive power that procurement can bring to making lasting change for your company.
Like you, John, there's so much to chew off on this. Bob, we in our work, we deal with procurement people all the time. And they're one of the toughest groups to actually try to get their attention on because they're so sporadic, right? They're doing so many different things. I'm in total agreement. Now, it's people like us and others who have to get other customers to do scope 1 and 2, and then this whole thing gets solved because it's not rocket science, right? This is completely doable. And we do have experience, both John and I have experience when companies do it, they are surprised how much it reduces their cost and increases their profitability. I had a meeting with a client that we've had since 2002. They've developed a program, an energy and a carbon program. They're Japanese. This company in Canada is deemed as one of the success stories in all of North America because of what they've done. And so it works. It's just the message is people don't actually understand the benefits behind it. Anything we can do, Bob, to help support this whole initiative, because I think it has an impact on Canada's future economy if we don't do it, truthfully.
Yeah, the stuff that you do is fantastic, and you're the enabler of organizations that wake up and decide that they want to do something, and then you help them do it. So we need your good efforts as well, and we'll meet at the finish line.
Yeah. And to be fair, Bob, we're just as challenged as you are because not a lot of people want to do it, just to be clear. Yeah. So.
Yeah, it's a big frustration for us. David, I can remember way back when we first got together and we were frustrated by the fact that people wouldn't make the effort to understand how much energy they were using and what they spent on it. That message hasn't changed, has it?
Right on.
Despite all the work. No, I think we have got to change, and I think things have moved on. But I think the good have got better, but there's still a big tranche of people who are not using good business practices in the broadest sense.
Absolutely. But look, if it were easy, it wouldn't be any fun.
Good way of looking at it, Bob.
That.
Good way to look at it. Well, gentlemen, thank you all for Bob. I really appreciate your time again, and we'll look forward to catch up again. Thank you. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks, Bob.
Take care.
Been really enjoyable. Thank you.
That's all for today's episode of the 360 on Energy and Carbon podcast. Thanks for listening. Make sure to check us out on our website at 360energy.net and follow us on LinkedIn at 360energy Inc. Tune in to our podcast on Apple Music, Spotify, Anchor, or other listening platforms by searching the 360 on Energy and Carbon. You can watch the video recording and subscribe on YouTube at 360 Energy Inc. Email us your feedback at podcast@360energy.net or comment on our LinkedIn posts. See you next week.